Live.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Camille Henderson. I am a third-year Master's of Divinity student at Candler School of Theology. And I'm also serving as the current graduate assistant here at the Carter Center with our Human Rights Program. Today, I am so excited. We have with us contributors from the book Sexual Violence and Sacred Texts. And this book is actually formed through various partnerships with the Carter Center and the Journal of the Feminist Study of Religion, and then also a panel that was convened by Dr. Elizabeth Schuster-Fiorenza. And the task during that panel was to identify methods of interpretation that could engender a process of healing from sexual violence and abuse perpetrated in and through sacred scripture. And so today, to talk about that book, that process, we have with us the editor of the book, Dr. Amy Kalmanofsky, who is Associate Professor of Bible at the Jewish Theological Seminary. We also have Dr. Sarra Lev, who is the chair of the Department of Rabbinic Civilization and Associate Professor of Rabbinic Literature at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. We also have Dr. Ayesha Chaudhry, who is an Associate Professor of Islamic and Gender Studies at the University of British Columbia. So welcome all three of you. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thanks.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And so for today, I wanted to get started with Dr. Kalmanofsky. So as editor of this book, you have given us an introduction. And in your introduction, you talk about how you have taken the feminist biblical canon. So these works of critical analysis essays that have taken a particular feminist perspective and have nuanced, have questioned, have challenged the way that we read sacred texts. And you ask each of us to consider it through the lens of our academic and religious orientations of how these texts can be read by individuals who have been sexually violated. And in your discussion, you bring up sort of two different categories of how feminist biblical scholarship can help those who have been sexually violated heal. And you talk about works that advocate on behalf of those who have been sexually violated, and then also works that are therapeutic for those who have been sexually violated. And so you write, just as there is a three-stage cycle of abuse, you've outlined a three-stage cycle or process of healing attuned with the goals and practices of feminist biblical interpretation. So in your discussion of your work, could you maybe highlight what does that process look like? What are those three stages, and how can persons who are watching today apply what it is that you have been writing about to their own lives and journeys of healing?
So let me just, I'm going to say that, address that in a second. But let me just say, first and foremost, what a privilege it was to be part of this panel initially. It was a great group of women that doing great work, I think really dealing with an issue that we were just chatting amongst ourselves before we went live, that who knew 3 years ago would be, so front and center in our national conversation right now.
Right.
So I feel like it was a great opportunity now and then, and now I feel like it's an unbelievably vital project and vital conversation to keep having. So I just wanted to say that. I also want to say that one of the, I said this also in the introduction to the book, you know, when Elizabeth first asked me, and probably all of us, to participate on this panel, I had great hesitation before taking this on, precisely because she asked us to think about the, you know, the ways that scholarship can work towards healing. And in some ways, the academic discourse and the discourse of, I don't even know how to describe it, but worrying about healing people, you know, that just, you know, it's not what academics do. Right? They're sort of living in their intellectual universe. And so it was very daunting to take on and think about the ways that actually the academic discourse can address people living through trauma and living with trauma and moving beyond that trauma. So it was an incredibly challenging thing for me, and I'm very grateful to have had that opportunity. So I just wanted to say that at the beginning. But this question of this 3 stages, you're right. In my essay, which is really, I'm a Bible scholar, so I'm really addressing biblical scholarship and feminist biblical scholarship in particular. I really do divide between scholarship that could be working towards advocacy, right? And just raising awareness around issues of sexual violation. And that's still obviously enormously important and always on the table. And then I sort of distinguish that from scholarship that can actually work towards healing. And you're right, I sort of identify 3 different stages in which you can engage with the scholarship that could be helpful in the healing process. You know, I was thinking about this just in preparation, thinking through my thoughts. In a way, 3 is an extremely neat number. And I just want to say outright, I mean, for obvious reasons, especially if you're in religious contexts. Right. But I don't pretend. I mean, for some people, the healing process may only take 1 stage, and for other people, the healing process could take 5, 6, 7, 8 stages, right? I mean, the 3 was just sort of a neat way for me to think, to sort of collect my own thoughts. But I would say the first stage really is having individuals engage with these texts, these sacred texts that describe sexual violation. And in some ways, just by confronting those texts, you're sort of naming that they exist, right? And naming that this kind of violence happens, right? It happens in our texts. And it happens in our lives. And so the first stage, I think, to healing, I mean, from my understanding of the, you know, the information around this, is just acknowledging that, right? And sort of recognizing that this violence happens. So that's kind of stage 1. And then you move to, I mean, I think that what I was trying to describe was a continuum that would take an individual really from a position of being a victim to a position of being a survivor. And, you know, those terms I'm using very intentionally. And I think the difference between being a victim and being a survivor really comes down to agency, right? And so the victim is somebody who feels that they're acted upon and lack very little agency. And the survivor is somebody that is able to assert agency and control over their own experience. So in these 3 different stages, the first stage, as I said, is sort of just acknowledging the violence, naming the violence. And the second 2 stages are ways for the individual to gain this kind of active agency. And basically, I feel like comes through the process of interpretation. And the first stage of interpretation is really, is what I would consider to be being a Bible scholar, really doing close reading and looking at these texts of sexual violation and looking at the assumptions, I would label the patriarchal assumptions behind these texts, and naming those assumptions, and also looking at the strategies, the patriarchal strategies that shape these texts. And so I feel like this, in this second stage, right, is in acquiring this kind of agency, is being that kind of interpreter and looking for those assumptions and looking for the strategies, but adhering close to the text itself. And then in the third stage, and I'm looking to my colleague Sarra, who's a rabbinic scholar, is sort of modeled on what I think is actually a kind of classic style of rabbinic learning, which is kind of a midrashic style, which is what the rabbis in Jewish tradition would do, which is that they, have a long tradition of filling in gaps and imaginatively thinking about not just what's in the text, but what is lacking from the text. And in actually, in some ways, being quite bold in sort of filling in those gaps. And I think that individuals that have suffered this kind of violation, and as they're trying to gain agency, I think that's a really powerful mode of interpretation. And essentially, they can use their voices, right, to give voice to characters that may actually have no voice in the text themselves. Right. And that's a tremendously powerful experience, and it will give them great agency. So those are the three stages that I outlined in the article.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, both, I think Dr. Chaudhry as well, and Dr. Kalmanofsky, you talk about this act of naming, and being able to name what is happening, what's going on. What for the victim and or survivor, what is powerful about the act of naming what is happening in the biblical text?
So I'll say that, and then I'm happy to also, Ayesha, because she also talks about this as well. But, I think, again, this is where I would connect it to what's going on right now, actually, with the conversation around Me Too. Mm-hmm. I think that in a certain sense, it validates your experience, right? Mm-hmm. Naming it within our sacred traditions, right? Looking at these texts and calling them for what they are, is a validation for this violence. And I think it's incredibly necessary, in the same way that we're hearing and beginning to listen to women's voices and validating their experiences. So that's what I think is empowering in that. It's like saying, no, these texts do exist. These experiences really did happen. And I think that we have to own that.
Mm-hmm. And I'm also inclined to bring up sort of this concept of biblical authority in the conversation of naming. I know even for myself, as a Master's of Divinity student, being able to claim agency in accepting my interpretation of the biblical text was difficult for me. So how was that process of being able to claim your space in reading of the sacred scripture, and then also finding things that are helpful for you in terms of applying your own interpretation, hermeneutic, what have you, specifically for individuals who have encountered some form of sexual violence?
Right. Well, I think that in some ways, again, coming from a Jewish perspective, in a way, we're ahead of the game. Mm-hmm. We definitely have the problem of sort of sacred texts that are part of the canon. And I think these texts, I mentioned this in both in my introduction and in my chapter. These are horrific texts that do have a sacred status. And just fundamentally, that's problematic, right? That's really problematic. And as I said, that there are individuals that would say, we just simply cannot, we can't give them that status anymore. These texts are too horrific, they're too violent. They are not sacred texts, and we should walk away and not engage with them. But, Jewish tradition, of which, what was great about this panel is that we are all scholars of, different religious traditions. But what also united us is that we were people of faith. And Elizabeth actually gave us the opportunity to really speak from our own particular faith perspectives. And Judaism is an interpretive tradition, actually. And that actually is something that is really, I think unique. Not every tradition is interpretive. But I think that we are really, in fact, engaging with the text, responding to it, what I described as this kind of midrashic process, is part of the DNA of what it means to be Jewish. So in some ways we own the interpretive process. And in some ways that makes it easier for us. At the same time that I have to say, I struggle certainly with this inherited canon that has this status that I think is problematic. So I realize the tension between those two things.
Okay, thank you. And so, Dr. Chaudhry, I want to move to you, going sort of back to that conversation on naming. In your essay, you talk specifically, or you ask about why some Muslim scholars still feel compelled to follow this sort of pre-colonial, patriarchal and violent readings of the Quran 434 when they can choose to follow any of the post-colonial nonviolent interpretations of that text. And so you examine that throughout your essay, and I would like to have you share with us what it is that you found in your examination, but then also if you could also speak to this act of naming, and you say that it's one of the most powerful tools available for Muslim feminists when they are formulating their argument, language, naming. So if you could speak to what power is found in naming, and then also share with us some of the things that you found in your examination of this text.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to be on this forum. And also, I want to second Amy's comments that it was such an incredible privilege to be part of this panel. And I think that we had a really rich discussion leading up to the panel, and then the panel itself was really wonderful. And then our conversations after. I mean, I'm so excited to be part of the sustained conversation. So the article actually came out of, this article is based on responses that I got to my book. And in many ways, the responses that I got to my book were about naming. So the book is called Domestic Violence and the Islamic Tradition. And one of the things that I was doing, well, what I do in the book is I do an intellectual history of this one verse in the Quran, chapter 4, verse 34, which people have interpreted historically, and some people in the contemporary period interpret as permitting husbands to hit their wives as a divinely sanctioned right. So in the pre-colonial period, we did this. What's interesting in the modern period is that that some Muslim majority states incorporate that into the law, so that you can't, so that domestic violence is actually not a criminal act in those countries. So you can see the implications of what those interpretations have. And one of the responses that I would get when I would give talks about my book, consistently, I would get two responses. One was, a lot of people did not like that I used the term domestic violence. And those were both Muslims, so especially Muslims didn't like that. They would say, it's not really domestic violence, it's just light beating, it's like tapping, it's non-violent hitting. Like, they didn't like the fact that I was using that word, domestic violence. And domestic violence is a very it's a charged word. I mean, even in the American and Canadian context, we didn't have domestic violence as a formal term until the 1970s. So I think it's very important that that was eventually named. And once it was named, it could be resisted. So that's one thing that I would say about the name, is that if you can't name a problem, you cannot resist it. And so you can't think about how to solve the problem or address it. Because if it doesn't have a name, then you're constantly being gaslighted to prove that it exists in the first place. So instead of putting your energies towards changing the situation, you're just proving that it exists, which is it takes a tremendous toll on victims of violence. So that's one thing. And the other response that I would get all the time that I think is somewhat related is that people would talk about, I consider myself a feminist Muslim. And people would say, well, feminist Islam is not really an authentic expression of Islam. And both Muslims and non-Muslims would say that to me. So I would get Arab men in the audience. I remember I gave a talk in Germany, and there was a Muslim man in the audience who basically was making this argument. And then there was a white woman in the audience making the same argument. And in both cases, they were positing Islam and feminism as static entities that were diametrically opposed to each other, and they couldn't understand how you could have an Islamic feminism that was Islamic. In both cases, in the case of the Arab man who was disagreeing with that term or resisting it, he was saying that I was imposing Western values on Islam, so I was corrupting Islam. And in the case of the white woman, she was arguing that I was imposing Western values on Islam, so this wasn't authentically an Islamic expression. So both of them were doing different things with that claim, but they were both making the same claim. And so this paper comes out of me grappling with those two responses that I was getting to the book whenever I gave talks. And one of the things that I try to say in the paper is that feminism, Islam, the West, these are all contested categories. They're not static. And often they demonize each other as a form of self-definition, because if they can define themselves in opposition to each other, then they can avoid the very real and important arguments that they're offering each other. They can avoid, people can avoid self-reflection and think about, for example, how patriarchy is complex and it exists everywhere and how we all participate in it. It also avoids, I think, conversations of race, because to believe that Islam is essentially patriarchal and to believe that Muslim feminists are an inauthentic expression of Islam from outside of the Muslim tradition is to participate in a racist discourse about Islam and Muslims. And from internally, it's to participate in a patriarchal discourse about Islam and Muslims. So it's all of these sort of labels. And so on the one hand, naming is important. On the other hand, naming can really do serious violence if it reduces the complexity of our humanity. And so what I thought about in this chapter that I really enjoyed in this article was to use a different Qur'anic story to help me think about the issues around naming. So I decided to use a story of the creation in the Quran, which is when God decides to create Adam. There's four main characters in the story. There's God, who decides to create Adam. And then there are the angels who say, why are you going to create someone who's just going to sow discord and shed blood? So it's a very essentialist definition of Adam's humanity. And then you have the angels and then you have Iblis, this one character, a character that might be an angel, but might not be an angel. And what happens is that God sort of doesn't respond to the essentialist critique of humanity that the angels offer. He teaches Adam the names of things. She teaches Adam the names of things. And then has this, sets up this elaborate test and asks the angels to name the things. We don't know what the things are. And then the angels are unable to, and they kind of call God on that. They say, we don't know the names of these things, but you know that we don't know the names of these things because you didn't teach them to us. And then Adam is able to name the things. And so then God asks the angels to prostrate to Adam. And all of them do except for Iblis, who then is named Satan. So becomes demonized by God, which is an interesting twist in the story. And one of the ways when I was looking at my article recently, this morning, I was thinking about is that this story in many ways is about essentialism, and that essentialism is satanic. So it's about racism and patriarchy and heteronormativity as essentialist categories. So maybe what's important is that we think about naming acts versus naming people is important. So you sort of think about, and that naming should be able to capture the diversity and complexity of humanity instead of reducing them to static and essentialist categories. And if we think about naming actions versus people, so if you name an action, you're naming a problem in someone's behavior that they're choosing to engage in versus naming the person as essentially X, Y, or Z, you can have much more complicated conversations around domestic violence. For example, all of the arguments, and recently I heard Angela Davis come and speak in Vancouver, and she had this whole conversation about carceral feminism and how she would really like us to resist going down the route of carceral feminism by leaning on a systemically unjust systems of policing and law enforcement and incarceration to solve the problem of domestic violence, because we should know that they're just going to replicate those inequalities. So I feel like those are some of the first initial thoughts that I guess I will share about in relation to the conversation we're having and about this chapter.
Yeah, so I think that was really great. I love what you said about how naming gives power to proving that what is happening exists. Right. Because I think that's so important for women, when we are in spaces where we are experiencing certain things that are positive or negative, and we don't really know if it's normal, if it's something that we should be afraid of, if it's something that we should address. And so to skate very closely to moving beyond, or moving to sort of like the what's next question, for that woman or that young girl who has then named what it is that she is dealing with, what then do we do with knowing that it exists? And I ask specifically because I will speak for millennials. I feel that we're sort of in this age where we know we're able to call out these things that are happening in our social spheres. And there's a lot of speaking truth to power. And, we love a good protest. We love a good hashtag. And so what specifically, though, for those individuals who are dealing with this process of healing and reconciliation, we know that it exists. And so what do we do with knowledge of its existence?
Right. I think that's a great question. And there's probably many answers to that question. Right. And I won't be able to answer all of them. But I think that, ultimately what I was trying to say in the paper was that naming is an act of power. And that in itself is really, really important, because if you can name a thing, then you can stop gaslighting yourself. You can stop you can avoid all of the self-doubt to be like, is this racist? Was this a racist thing that happened to me? Was this, like sexism that I just experienced? Or was it just like this person's Irish culture that makes him this way, which, by the way, I have been told once when I was being treated with sexism and racism by a male that, oh, that's just his culture, his Irish culture. And so so I feel like, so the fact that when you can name a thing, you can stop engaging in this endless cycle of self-doubt and isolation. And it allows you to then begin to, intellectually theorize about it. But if you're a victim of violence and you're thinking through it also, it allows you to seek help in relation to it. It allows you to build alliances and allies. It allows you to build communities so that you can support each other. There's so many things that become possible with the act of naming. But, as I said, naming is an act of power. And so it can be wielded in tyrannical and really constructive ways. It depends on who it is that is wielding that power. And that's why, for example, I testified in Parliament in Canada around this motion M103 on Islamophobia. And one of the strategies of the Conservatives for those hearings was to basically just engage in endless semantic debate about whether Islamophobia was the right term, so that we could not have a conversation, avoid the conversation that there has been like 256% increase in hate crimes against Muslims, but instead be like, what is Islamophobia really? Is that the right term? So I feel like semantics, these games that we play around names, they're so important and they're worth paying attention to. And I think that's why in the Qur'anic story, the act of naming is such an important, like that is such a pivotal part of the creation story, is that once we are human, we have the power to name, and how we name is a moral act. Yeah.
That's powerful. Thank you. And so, Dr. Lev, in your piece, you write about something that I had never heard before and was deeply, deeply moved. And so you open it, you say that it is common to refer to both the sacred texts as living texts. And you say that I have come to understand this not only as a comment about permission to interpret these texts according to societal shifts, but also as the charge to interact with them. In light of that, I have begun to think of these texts not as holy texts, but as texts in search of holiness themselves. And I had never come in contact with that. And of course, so we are in different contexts. For myself as a Christian, and then you in the Jewish context. But what does that mean for us to read texts that are themselves in search of holiness?
Yeah. So first of all, I also want to just echo Amy and Ayesha's comments about what a privilege it is to be working with these particular people, these particular women on this subject, because it's been an amazing conversation that's stretched over some years now. So thank you for that, and thank you for having me. So I think it comes down, for me, first of all, let me say that when Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza asked us to come to this and think about how these texts can promote healing, I said to her that I'm not sure I think they can. And so my question in writing this paper was not about whether or how these texts can promote healing, but how we can heal from the violence that these texts themselves perpetrate on victims of sexual abuse, or even on women in general who are not victims of sexual abuse, who might be reading these texts which promote sexual violence or contain sexual violence. And so that was my starting point in this project. And for me, I think it comes down to how we think about the role of these texts. So do we think that these texts are there, what we call these holy texts, do we think that these holy texts are there to tell us what ought to be, which is often how it's traditionally read, right? This is how we know not to murder, because the texts say don't murder, and so that we treat these texts as if they are our rule book, or as if they're telling us or teaching us something about how life ought to be? Or do we think that they are there to tell us what is, which is another option? Or do we think that they're there to call us to mold what is into the shape of holiness? So I read this as a text that's there not to impart to us its holy wisdom per se, but to draw out our holy wisdom. And so I start with two assumptions. We talked about Ayesha talked about the creation story in Muslim tradition. I start from the creation story in Jewish tradition, which is similar, where God is the creator, not just of human beings and certainly not just of men, but of everything. And so holiness to me has to take into account all of God's creation. So any text that we profess as holy can't act against that principle. And so the texts that we're talking about today in this forum don't follow that principle if we read them as what ought to be or what is. So what I'm proposing is that rather than reading them as holy texts in that sense, that is, texts that tell us what holiness is or what we need to do to be holy, that we think of them as partners in a quest for holiness. So the texts themselves are in search of that holiness just as we are in search of that holiness. But when the text draws out our holy wisdom, we reread the text, and that changes the text itself. And so then it becomes a question of how do we, so then if the text isn't those two things, then what does that look like? So if like I was thinking this morning of, okay, what's a good example of this for me? And so I was thinking of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So in that biblical account, two of God's messengers arrive in Sodom and they're put up at the house of Lot. And that night, the text says that the people of Sodom surrounded the house and they demanded to know, which means to have sex with, Lot's guests. And then the text says, from young to old, all the people to the last. That's how it describes it. And Lot's solution to that threat is that the threat to his guests is to tell the people that they can have his two young daughters who are virgins, and they can rape them, and you know, then he'll protect his guests. And Lot's righteousness is demonstrated in that by saying, I'll bring them out for you so you can do what you wish to them. But to these people, please don't do anything, for they have come under the protection of my roof. That's what Lot says to them. Now, so I was thinking about the problem presented by this text here is that Lot can't protect his guests from rape. The text has nothing to do with homosexuality whatsoever, and early Jewish texts barely mention homosexuality in connection with the text. But then in the 4th century, Augustine reads this text as about homosexuality, and from then on, the text becomes about homosexuality. So what I mean by that we read these texts as themselves as texts in search of holiness is that the text itself changes depending on how we read it. So when Augustine reads it as about homosexuality, that completely shifts the text. And from then on, it gets read as about homosexuality, even though that's not what the text is about. So when we read a text, we get to direct that text. That text itself becomes a living being that changes and shifts. So I'm not by any means suggesting that Augustine's reading was a step in the direction toward the quest for holiness, though I'm sure he would have considered it as such. But what I'm pointing out is that these texts are living and growing, and our readings change them, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. And I'm suggesting that if we read these texts, as partners in that search for holiness, and that we understand that both we and the text change as we engage in that text, that we're partners in that process. So that's it.
So you also talked about, though, reading sacred texts in the genre of summons.
Yeah.
And that was also something that I had never heard before. So could you then sort of expound on this conversation of reading the text as themselves in search of holiness, then what does it mean to read the sacred text as a genre of summons? And what is the process? You talk about how the text reveals certain things about ourselves. So then what is that process of coming to this moment of revelation between texts that could be harmful or texts that could be edifying, but reading the sacred text in the genre of summons?
Yeah. So that's, I feel like that's the second stage of this, of what I'm talking about this quest for holiness is. So what do we do then? You know, what's next? As you posed that question, both for Ayesha and to Amy. So what's next? So for me, the way that we engage in that quest is to read the text as if it is summoning us to become more holy. And so if we take this text, the Sodom text, if the parameters of holiness are that it has to extend to all of God's creations. And so this text cannot be a holy text if we read it in the traditional manner, because essentially Lot offers up his daughters to be raped in place of these men. But if this is a text in search of holiness, then it demands a reading that calls Lot to account for offering up his daughters to be raped, and calls to account his guests, who are messengers of God, after all, and who are standing there as these women are being offered up to be raped. So they are complicit in this crime. And then the story becomes a summons to us. So at the moment that we recognize that these are the dynamics of this text, then it becomes a summons for us to examine our own complicity when injustice is perpetrated on others. When do we stand by? Who do we throw in front of the bus in order to protect somebody else? What injustices or atrocities do we accept when they're done to some people, but not to other people? Who are the people that we overlook, and who do we privilege? And it starts to, it summons us to ask those questions. Okay, if this is what this holy text is doing, is telling us, if this is the story that we're supposed to interact with, then who are we in that story? And I feel like we can all answer those questions. There is nobody, none of us are free from those moments of throwing somebody under the bus in order to save somebody else, whether because they're our guests or whether because of other reasons. And so I think, so when we treat the text as in that quest for holiness, then we become the actors. And we ask ourselves those questions, and that text pushes us to reflect on our own holiness. And by doing that, it allows it to become holy, and that changes us and allows us to become more holy in our daily practice.
That is powerful. And so I want to bring both Dr. Kalmanofsky and Dr. Chaudhry back into the conversation. And again, this is a conversational piece. So I know that you all have been taking notes throughout the course of this discussion. So please feel free to interject, to add anything that we add to anything that we have been talking about.
Can I actually respond to Sarra?
Yes, please.
Because, first of all, I just want to also say that in some ways, the story of Lot's daughters, you know, I mean, in the end of that story, of course, and to some extent, Lot's daughters hold Lot accountable, right? I mean, you know, the end of that story is actually, so just even in the biblical context, that story is very, you know, I think has an inherent critique to it. But I remember asking you this on the panel those many years ago. I basically share your orientation, and I think we all share, you know, I tried to say this in the introduction to the volume. I think the thing that connects all of us as scholars, you know, is the sense that we understand the power of interpretation, and we want to own that power. Totally understand that, right? And yet I do feel like, you know, I love your take on the summons, these texts that summon us to action, and that we sort of, it's our duty to sort of infuse them with the holiness. It's sort of on us. You know, there's a certain sense where I actually kind of resent having to engage with these texts. Like, I don't want to be summoned to this kind of conversation with these particular texts. And I realize I don't actually come from the orientation that these texts are inherently holy. I don't, right? That's not my religious orientation. That's not where I come from. But I do feel like these texts are, is what I was trying to say in the introduction, in my own remarks here, they are inscribed with a kind of holy status. And so we are kind of forced over and over and over again to engage with these texts. And we can say it's on us to rise to the challenge that they pose. It's on us to find the meaning. But again and again, we go back to these texts. And that's, to me, I mean, as I said in the intro to this book, being a religious person, I'm not willing to walk away from these texts. It is the language of my tradition. These are the sacred stories of my tradition. But on a certain level, I resent that. And it makes me angry and frustrated. And I feel that to some extent what we're doing in some ways, and all of us, Ayesha as well, is justifying texts that actually can't ultimately be justified. And are we complicit, is your language, by engaging with them in this way and finding meaning in them? Are we complicit? And we may be. And that's, that to me is what I struggle with very deeply. So I don't know if you want to respond, if each one, I don't know.
Well, I mean, I would say, I think, Amy, that's such an interesting interjection, because of course, in each of our traditions, that conversation happens on various parallels. And ultimately, I would say, I think, like agreeing with Sarra, or I think I'm agreeing with Sarra. She can tell us if I am or not. But I feel like texts, I don't think that these texts have essential meanings. I don't think texts ever have essential meanings. Texts are always, these texts like these that are meaning generating, are only ever interpreted by community in relation to a community. So these texts never actually speak for themselves. People speak for the text. Yeah. And as such, they speak differently to. Who is this?
I think we're back.
Are we back?
Did we all go away, or I thought it was just me?
We might have lost Amy, but I believe that our tech team is on it, so you can continue talking.
Okay. So I feel like these texts have they do not have an inherent meaning in and of themselves, except through the communities that they interact with, and as such. I believe that when we participate in this act of reinterpretation, for me, what I'm often doing in my work, I find, is not even offering new interpretations necessarily, but really just voicing mainstream interpretations that don't get any airtime. Because often the voices that dominate interpretations of Islamic texts are marginal voices that don't represent the vast majority of Muslims. There's 1.6 billion Muslims, but whenever we see Muslims represented on television, on media, in mosques, studies show that over 80% of Muslims are not regular mosque goers. So even mosque going Muslims are not representative of Muslims. And when you see them in the State House, in the State Department, or the White House, everybody always wants Muslims who look Muslim. And so they're not inherently not representative of Muslims. Just recently I spoke at the UN, and I was asked by one of the women who was organizing it, a white Christian woman, if I wouldn't mind, if she wanted me to wear hijab so I would look more Muslim to her mind. And so it would be like, that they had a religiously diverse panel, and that I would, so it's sort of interesting to me, like the role that the angels play. It's like the kind of performances of religiosity that you're expected to perform. And so I feel like when those people read these texts, everybody has a different interpretation. So I don't feel like I'm complicit so much as I'm explaining or offering air time to perspectives that are actually all around us, but don't get heard and don't get seen as authentic.
Dr. Lev, I'm curious, would you have a response as well?
I mean, I can't tell you how many times when I was doing my dissertation work or my comps, I turned to my study partner and said, "Why am I studying these texts? They're horrifying." And so I certainly agree with Amy and about how difficult that is. I don't know. I mean, yes, I think I live in the paradox of being complicit with agreeing to study these horrifying texts and I do treat them as holy texts. Although I agree with you. I think that what I think is inherently holy in these texts is that they call us to action, as opposed to what they're actually saying. And I think that's why I have to reframe it in those particular ways, is because I can't, if I accept the notion that holiness has to transcend individuality, has to apply to all of God's creation, then I can't read these texts in any other way. So yes, I think there's a certain amount of paradox to saying, yes, I'm going to engage in these texts and I find them horrifying. And I think this is kind of my attempt at solution to that. In terms of, Ayesha, what you were saying about, like, I'm not sure if what the majority of Jews think about these texts. I think that they don't actually even know most of these texts. And so that there isn't a strong interpretive tradition that's moving in the direction of, there's a small interpretive tradition that's moving in the direction of critiquing these texts. But I don't know, maybe Amy, you know more about that than I do, but I know there's a small Jewish feminist interpretive track. But I wish that was, you know, that we were voicing the interpretations of the majority, but I don't know that we are.
It's interesting. So we as academics, I feel, interact with the text in different ways. And I think that through our areas of study, we've been able to sort of prepare ourselves or build ourselves up in order to interact with these texts that can be harmful. I'm curious, though, for the young 21-year-old girl who is also a part of the Me Too movement, and she comes in contact with this text. Is there a need for certain individuals to protect themselves almost from interacting with these texts? And I'm speaking most of Dr. Kalmanofsky about your comments of always coming in contact with these texts that could potentially be harmful, but we as academics have built ourselves up in order, you know, to be able to make meaning in that. But what about those who don't have that background or that experience?
Yeah. So I'll just say, from, you know, working with the students I work with, I think it's actually a real problem. You know, maybe it's not a problem. Maybe it'll take us where we need to go. But I think younger people are going to be less willing to do the struggle that Sarra, you know, and I have been doing for longer, Ayesha, than you have been doing it, you know, just by virtue of our age. I think that more and more people are actually going to say, no, this does not reflect my reality. It's not a reality I want to engage with. In particular, I'm speaking more in liberal Jewish corners, you know, where there's, you know, an emphasis on choice, right? What am I going to choose to take on? What am I going to choose not to take on? It's up to me. I think it's going to be hard to have people relate to these texts in the same way. I think I think this is a real challenge.
You know, I think also, like, I want to second what Amy and Sarra were saying. Like, it's not like I love the text that I worked on for the book. I wish it would go away and I didn't have to do it. But I also know that it has a real impact on living, believing Muslims, the young Muslims. And I know that when I was a young Muslim and I encountered this verse, it broke my heart, and doing the research broke my heart. And one of the things that I was trying to do in my work, and that I try to do, is offer young Muslims a way to preserve their dignity as like complicated human beings in relation to these divine texts, these texts that they consider divine, so that they don't feel alienated from their own humanity by these texts, and they don't feel rejected by their religious community and by whoever it is that they understand to be God. And so for me, that's one of the things that I think about when I'm doing my research. And so in my book, for example, in offering an intellectual history of this verse and showing the various ways it can be interpreted, but also showing how incredibly violently it was interpreted in the pre-colonial period, one of the things that I was trying to do was really, you know, bearing the tradition, quote unquote, like the great men of the past, to say, we don't have to be tied to their interpretations. And claims that are made to authority by appealing to the authority of these men are not necessarily more authoritative or more interesting or more just or more moral. In fact, often might be none of those things. And so offering young Muslims who don't want to walk away from Islam just yet to find a way to still be, believe in gender equality and believe that, men and women and other genders are equal before the eyes of God. That's where, I usually say that in my classes too, is that, I think of religious feminism as a space between blind submission and rejection. And I respect the position of rejection also. Like, I get it. Like, some people are like, I don't want to do this anymore. Why am I going to struggle to be part of a tradition that I feel is constantly spitting me out? I get it.
Yep.
But then my research is not there. It's not for those people. That's not what I'm doing.
And I would just add to what Ayesha is saying that that not only are they not more moral or not more, but they're also not more right.
Yes.
And as we see with Augustine's interpretation, which actually is completely off the topic of the text, and he's got an agenda. Right. And so when we're accused of bringing agenda in as if there was no agenda before us and we are the ones who introduced agenda into these texts, I think that's the other piece of this, is that agenda is part and parcel. I mean, as you said about community, right? It depends on what community you're in, what this text says.
Right.
So I think that's another piece of it.
Yeah, but we're fighting, we're all fighting in our own ways for, in fact, our interpretations to actually bear the weight of authority and to be taken seriously. And that's, it's an ongoing struggle. I'm all like, I feel like, the things living with the canon as it is certainly something that we struggle to do, but also how to expand the canon to include our voices. And, for all of us in our different, orbits, I think it's an uphill battle and easier for some of us than for others, but it's not easy for any of us, to expand that canon and to have our interpretations have the same weight of authority as the traditional interpretations, which are in fact male interpretations and are, part of what is for all of us actually, part of a patriarchal tradition.
Yeah.
And so I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Liv.
No, I was also going to say, just renaming, like in connection to naming, that we name those the traditional interpretations. Like when we call them traditional, we're giving them that power as well.
Yep.
So,
right.
So there's a way in which, and we all do that.
Yep.
So with the last 10 minutes of this conversation, I also want to talk about or acknowledge that we are biblical scholars, academics, that we have been studying for years. And again, this element of agency that we have claimed in interacting with sacred texts. But I am thinking of what, they teach in seminary about building your own hermeneutical framework. And we spend lots of time and energy and money learning how to appropriately build this sort of framework that we can use to develop different interpretations of the sacred texts, so that when we release these heteronormative patriarchal texts, we have a specific framework to use in developing our own liberating interpretation as it relates to our social context. So I wonder, for the individual who has not spent time, money, hours in theological libraries, and who may not even be involved in the faith community and may not even go to the mosque or the temple or church on a consistent basis. What are your thoughts on being able to develop then an appropriate framework that will enable that individual to create his or her interpretation that is liberating for them?
I think, like the feminist framework of subjectivity being essential to understanding the production of scholarship. So scholarship is political, and that subjectivity basically forms scholarship. is really, really important. I think it's useful in this conversation, because when we think about how, quote unquote, the canon or the tradition has interpreted texts, they have very much been shaped by their own subjectivities. And what it does is, I think, to take subjectivity seriously allows us for our subjectivities to inform our interpretations, and for that not to be a problem, for that to be part of how scholarship is produced, and how we can always be suspicious and expect blinders in all of our interpretations, because we are limited by our subjectivities, whether it's heteronormativity, whether it's our social class, whether it is our ethnicity, our gender, our race. All of these things affect the kinds of scholarship we produce, the things we see, the questions we ask, and the places we look for those answers to those questions. So I think that that's like a space where that is really useful and really important for us to think about. And also, I think the most important thing that taking our subjectivity seriously and honoring it actually does is it allows instead of us reaching for the text all the time, it allows us to have the text reach to us. Like, if these texts are universal and they're meant to speak to people in all times and places, then we're all good enough for the text to speak to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just want to say the obvious too. I feel like, I mean, and maybe this is just naive, I'm not sure that anyone actually would, like, I think all of our texts are encountered in a somewhat mediated fashion. Like, I don't think anyone would sort of stumble upon these texts and like, you know, what am I going to do with this? I think that for the most part, certainly as a Bible scholar, people in some ways are always introduced to these texts within a kind of mediated framework. And you know, I really feel, I mean, I teach in a seminary, and I have students that are training for the academy, but I have students that are training to become rabbis out in the world. And I really feel like, you know, I'm providing a framework to people who will then provide a framework for others, and will be the individuals that will be able to mediate the encounter. And I take that extremely seriously. Like, I'm trying to give my students the skills to be able to then introduce and translate these texts and use them for, you know, for people who are not academics and professionals that don't have this critical framework. So, you know, I can't answer, like, you know, somebody who doesn't have any context sort of stumbling upon, you know, any of these texts would probably, like, you know, go back and horror, this is hard. I don't have any interest in having a relationship. But I think most people find our texts somehow already within a context. And I feel incredibly motivated to really provide the language and the training to the people that are going to be the teachers of, you know, the mediators for other people.
Yeah, and I would just say, I too don't know how to answer how does somebody who comes from nowhere close to these texts come and engage with these texts or find their own hermeneutical framework. But I can say that my hermeneutical framework, or the one that I'm trying to invest in, is asking myself the question, how does this text enable me or push me to be a holier person on the planet? And to just start from that question and see where it takes me.
Amen.
Dr. Amy Kalmanofsky, Dr. Ayesha Chaudhry, and Dr. Sarra Lev, thank you all so much for joining us for this roundtable.
Thank you for having me.
We have discussed the book Sexual Violence in Sacred Texts, found on Amazon. Yeah.
Yes.
It is a wonderful read. And again, this conversation has been so fruitful. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.